Throughout the book of Vayikra, we learn of details of ritual law centered around the Mikdash, the temple. We read of laws of the Kohanim serving in the temple, laws of sacrifices, kosher and non-kosher animals, laws of life and death, and laws of ritual purity and impurity. This week's Parshiot, Tazria-Metzora, continue on these themes. We read of the purification process of the Yoledet, a woman who has just given birth, the commandment to circumcise baby boys on the 8th day, laws of people, homes, or garments afflicted with biblical leprosy, or tzara'at, and their purification process, and bodily discharges which render us ritually impure. These laws would all seem to be centered around God and God's prescriptions for how to approach the sacred and sanctify the profane. Yet throughout the book of Vayikra, God is largely absent. God commands us, but there's no back and forth. There's no conversation. For a change in status to occur, we simply perform the prescribed actions. God is not otherwise involved. In our Parsha, Parshat Tazria, when the Torah describes the Yoledet, a woman who has just given birth, it focuses on the days of ritual impurity and her process of becoming ritually pure. This process involves passage of time, bringing sacrifices in the Mikdash, mediated by the Kohen, and immersion in the mikveh. That's what brings about her change in ritual status. But God isn't involved actively in the process per se. Dr. Tammy Jacobowitz, a scholar of Midrash, points out that the Midrash in Vayikra Rabbah provides a drastic contrast to these psukim by infusing God at every step in the birth process. Dr. Jacobowitz reflects on the Midrash. She writes, by focusing on the fetus, the rabbis frame the relationship between God and each human being as always already present, even as the person himself is still in formation. In the Midrash, God's involvement is exquisitely intimate. In one passage, a baby is compared to a prisoner, residing all alone in the dark. God features as a kind stranger who shows up to light a candle to provide warmth, comfort, and companionship. In another, God is likened to a wonderful friend who unexpectedly presents an astounding return on an investment, from a white drop to a fully formed human being. All of God's kindness and protection is imagined within that impossibly small space, the womb, drawing God into the personal universe of each and every human being. God is man's companion, friend, nurturer, parent, and caregiver. The Midrash makes clear how God's loving kindness sustains and accompanies us in the dark, precarious, and isolated existence of the womb. The womb is compared to a prison, and God's support is what allows us to go out into the world, out to freedom, and to live life. Much of ritual law in our Parshiot focuses on the human body. It is our physical embodiment which allows us to interface with the world and with the divine. Our bodies are holy and therefore demand attention, sensitivity, and care. The case of the Metzora, the person afflicted with biblical leprosy, is another in our Parsha, where a person's physical status brings about isolation. The Torah describes tzara'at in depth, but does not provide an explanation for why a person is stricken with this biblical leprosy. And there is no explicit judgment of the Metzora in the Torah. In fact, the Midrash provides 7 different explanations for tzara'at, for why it occurs, which points to the very fact that we just don't know the real reason that a person gets tzara'at. Rabbi Daniel Coleman notes that tzara'at is not referred to in the Hebrew as a machala, but rather as a nega, which has the same root as the word naga, touch. Perhaps this explains why the leaders in our nation, Moshe and Miriam, were touched by tzara'at, by this affliction. Maybe experiencing tzara'at indicates that one is on a high spiritual level, and tzara'at is a marker of this spiritual level. But we do know of the purification process of the Metzora. The Metzora is sent out of the camp. The pasuk states, "He shall be unclean as long as the disease is on him. Being unclean, he shall dwell apart. Badad yeshev, his dwelling shall be outside of the camp. Michutz lamachane moshavo." The Torah says the Metzora dwells apart. the Metzora does maintain a connection with the community, a connection point with the Kohen, who comes to evaluate the Metzora and facilitate their transition back into the community. But Tzaraat still leads to isolation from loved ones, from social ties. This is an isolation which sadly we can all now relate to in one measure or another. Moshe, who was stricken with Tzaraat as well, was also raised outside of his community, away from his home, michutz lamachaneh. It was actually there that he experienced Tzaraat as a sign given by God at the burning bush. In Moshe's separation from his family, from community, Moshe took a moment to go and look at the burning bush, and there Moshe found that God was there to accompany him on his journey. The purification process of the Metzora means he or she must go through a period of separation, of waiting and uncertainty, just as we all have experienced and are experiencing. But the Kohen visits as a guide, a bridge back to community, to bring the Metzora back to connection. The Midrash on Tazria invites us to remember that in places of deep solitude and isolation, like the fetus in the womb, God is with us, accompanying us and sustaining us. The Metzora, who is touched by Tzaraat, is visited by the Kohen as they sit on their own outside of the camp. Moshe, tending to his sheep in the desert, separated from his family, takes a moment to look and finds God at the burning bush. What if we, like them, could feel God's presence reassuring us in our isolation?